Welcome to Civilnet. My guest is Dr. Armine Ishkanian, who's a social anthropologist who teaches at London School of Economics. Armine is initially from Armenia, has studied in the United States, and has frequently written about social democratic processes in Armenia, the post-Soviet processes, the would-be democratic processes. Armine, welcome to Civilnet. Was that a fair introduction?
I think so. Thank you, Salpi Ghazarian.
Armine, you just made the news. You've been all over Facebook in Armenia specifically because in the follow-up to the elections, after the press conference that OSCE ODIHR held, the preliminary press conference, when a group of activists tried to kind of take over the show and say that, you know, what you guys have seen is not really what things were. They didn't let them speak, of course, and you chose that as the opportunity to write a letter.
Yes, I did.
What was your beef?
Well, basically, I had just been writing an article about 20 years of democracy promotion in the former Soviet countries. And just when I submitted that article, I was watching what was going on in Armenia, and I thought, well, isn't this a bit hypocritical that for 20 years they've been talking about promoting civil society, democracy, voice, participation, and yet when a group of activists come into the meeting, all they could say was, let's take a break, let's take a break. And they couldn't engage with the activists at that level. So I felt I just had to raise that point and say, well, why didn't you listen? Because they were there to hear, you know, to speak to you. And that's why I also linked it to what's happening globally, where young people are taking to the streets and squares and to social networks in order to be heard, because they're often excluded from mainstream political parties and feel disillusioned by the systems of power.
Precisely because they're not heard through the system, they take to the streets, just like we did in 1988.
Yes.
You got an answer.
I did get an answer. They sent me an answer today. They emailed it to me, and they also posted it on my Facebook page. And their excuse or their argument, I'll read it out to you, was that had our mission been contacted by the group prior to election day, we would also have gladly met with their representatives then. Such exchanges, as already mentioned, are important to our work. Now, if it was before election day, the report wouldn't have been there. So what would the activists have to say? What they also said is the exchange was impossible during the press conference because rather than asking for the floor and engaging the heads of the mission, as did the other participants, the activists chose to address a statement directly to the cameras and media present in the room. Had she addressed the question to one of our heads of mission, then they would have spoken to her. So basically they said, because you didn't speak to us, we decided to leave in order to give an opportunity for the activist to finish reading her statement. Now, that's slightly problematic because you're there. You are there to listen. And so if they didn't ask for your permission, does that mean you're not going to listen to them? It seems slightly absurd in my opinion, because they were there, they could have listened. At first they had said, oh, they were speaking in Armenian, we don't understand Armenian. And that's why in my letter, my original letter, I had said, actually you had an interpreter there. Could the interpreter not have translated for you what the activists were saying?
Now, you know, what we seem to have here is obviously, clearly, a difference of either vision or approach. And what you have called election fraud 2.0, that processes have moved on, that what those who were engaged in fraud used to do 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, has now changed. And clearly, this last election seemed to indicate that the people too have changed, that I may in fact take the 5,000 tanam you want to offer me, but you know what, I'm going to vote for whoever I want to vote for, which is why the Rafi vote was such a surprise. Now, in between, there's the observers, the international observers. Do they not know about 2.0, that these processes have in fact moved on and they need to perhaps change methodology?
I think they should know. That's their job, isn't it? I mean, and I think they were also warned. There's an independent think tank, Policy Forum for Armenia. They had published a report about the parliamentary elections of 2012, specifically talking about the new forms of election fraud. And that was released a couple of months before the presidential elections. Moreover, a few days before the elections, Policy Forum for Armenia sent a press release, again, directed to the observers, cautioning them about having to pay attention to different forms of election fraud. So there isn't this excuse, well, the information wasn't there. The information was there. Whether you consult it and take it on board is another issue. And I think they needed to take that on board because it's become partially a game that reifies itself in the sense that whatever happens with the the governments have learned to play the game, and they've learned how to manage democracy. They've learned how to put on a very good show, and this is not just in Armenia, it's across the former Soviet countries. And for that reason, the observers have to perhaps develop other strategies, other methods, go deeper in their analysis, and not just look for the old ballot stuffing that they're used to looking for.
You're following, I'm sure, the rest of the events that are going on, and it's part of this 2.0, the tough contest that should have taken place between candidates, among candidates before the election. It's taking place after the election. But we're on the streets. There are no processes, there are no mechanisms, it seems, for moving this off the street into the legitimate political forum. What do other peoples do? Where do we go off the street?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think nobody really has an answer. And that's always been the question directed at social movements of what happens after the square, what happens after the street, and how do you scale up? And I think it can go in many different ways. It really depends on who's leading and who has certain ideas of where to take it. It's impossible to predict also what the government is prepared to do and what the government is planning to do. It's a dialectical process between civil society and the state, not to mention the political parties and the political leaders. So I think it's impossible to predict what's going to happen, but definitely there's so much happening in terms of the student protests, in terms of Rafi decentralizing the protest, going around the country, which hasn't really been done before. Here we're going into new territory because I've observed the elections in Armenia. I've been writing about them since 1996, and you can see there's a pattern. The election happens, people protest, then something happens and they disperse. Of course, March 1st, 2008 was slightly different in the sense that the authorities used violence to disperse and to end the protest. But we don't know what's going to happen here. And March 1st is approaching, and again, there's so much in the mix that it's very difficult to say. And I think in some ways you have civil society trying to say it's not about the individual, it's not about the person, it's about the process, it's about rights, it's about social justice, it's about democracy. And we talked about 2.0. I would say, we're also looking at civil society 2.0. It's a new generation. These are some of the young people weren't even born in 1988. So they are the new citizens and they have a new vision. And that's why I was saying to the observers, you need to listen because they didn't grow up in the Soviet period. You can't, tar them by saying, oh, they're just so, they're carrying on the Soviet legacy. These are not people who lived under the Soviet period. They have different views. They've grown up under a different system. And that's why I think it's important to hear what they're saying, even, when they break into your press conference in not the most polite fashion, as some people have pointed out.
Extend that point that you made. It's an interesting observation that these activists are really the ones who never saw 1988. It's not as if they've already had a revolution that they consider failed somehow. They really haven't lived that euphoria and then, to some extent, disappointment, fair or otherwise. For these, it's a blank slate. This is their first attempt out. Well,
I don't know necessarily if it's their first, because 2008, many of them might have been also participating in 2008.
Perhaps younger.
In Azadutan Haraparak, in Liberty Square. But I think for many of them, the past 2-3 years, we've seen, and my research team and I have been mapping this, we've been looking at the growth of civic initiatives, that have emerged in the past 2-3 years around a variety of issues, from ecology to the use of public space and so forth. And you can see it's a group of activists, are involved in a lot of these initiatives. And they were also involved in talking to the observers and taking it elsewhere. So I think it's a new generation of activists, and for that reason, it's something that's that's rather different from 1988, and it's something that we have to look at and see how it will develop.
Thank you. This is going to be an interesting period still, and perhaps we can talk again. The observations, your observations, both from within what's happened to society here and from a bit of a distance, are very useful, especially in the context of what others are doing. We often miss that. Thank you, Armine Ishkanian, Professor, Social Anthropologist at London School of Economics, talking to us on Civilnet today about the OSCE observers, methodology, perhaps needs for change, and the post-electoral processes in Armenia.
Thank you, Salpi.
Thank you for watching Civilnet.